Facebook. We have a lot of questions queuing up. So I'm going to move first to Ms. Jody O'Brien. And the question is, how would the social fund be supported? I think more emphasis should be placed on tax collection and protecting low-income earners. Don't you think a social fund creates a kind of welfare state which is counterproductive, that is not growth-oriented? So I'm going to give Mr. Matalon that question to start the ball rolling.
I think it's a very, very good question. It's an important question. And I want to use first of all, as I said at the outset of my presentation, one of the things that the committee recommended in 2003-04 was that we generally shift away from our dependence on taxes on direct income towards consumption. And the way that we do that is to broaden the base of items that are subject to GCT, for example, and use some of the revenue that we generate in order to increase, for example, the threshold under the personal income tax so that we remove more lower income earners from the tax roll as a whole. But the business of removing, for example, the exemptions on particular items under the GCT is a very emotive one. And there is this unexamined assumption, in my view, that those exemptions benefit the poorest in the society, the most vulnerable in the society. Statistics that I have looked at, which have attempted to determine the amount of the benefit of those exemptions that actually get to the lowest 20% of income earners in the country, suggests that only about 8% of the value of the exemptions actually reach those individuals. And that is obviously very inefficient. In other words, we're providing an investment to all consumers, whether they fall within the group that is most vulnerable or not. I enjoy the same exemption on basic foods as the more vulnerable, not including that. And therefore, that is why we argue that we ought not to attempt to achieve the social welfare objective of protecting the most vulnerable through the tax system. What we would like to see is a much broader base, many more items that are not subject now to GCT, being subject to GCT at lower rates of overall tax. And that we use a substantial part of the revenue so generated either to increase the threshold under the personal income tax, or to fund targeted expenditure programs like the PATH program, but others that can be devised that attempt to protect the most vulnerable in our society on a very targeted basis, so that they're not getting 8% of the benefit of what we're spending, but are getting maybe 70 or 80% of the benefit of what we are spending in an attempt to try and protect.
All right, thank you, Mr. Martin. I'm going to ask Dan Robert, you want to comment on the social welfare fund, welfare state?
Yeah, well, I certainly don't think you can escape having some element of religion in any economy. All the economies of the world, welfare protection for the most vulnerable. In fact, if you read a report from the World Bank, the multilateral agency, they will tell you about the importance, particularly in this time, that is possible to protect those who are in. So, whereas it is not the most desirable way to the situation, it is certainly a pragmatic response to a situation in which there are some form of protection.
All right, thank you very much. Another question from our Facebook viewers. I've seen the name now, but the overall gist of the question is, how does special interest groups, how do special interest groups influence the tax reform agenda, right? And it's coming from Anna Kim Robinson. How does stakeholder interests influence the formulation and implementation of tax reform policy? And indeed, this has been a major problem in Jamaica. We have strong lobby from various interest groups regarding tax incentives. Mr. Denny, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. One of the things I think we've had a problem with over the years is that our budget process has lacked a level of consultation. We have seen things improving, and certainly in the most recent budget, there was quite a lot of consultation, but it would seem within a narrower band, and certainly through my participation in the Partnership for Transformation initiative, and also through the PSOJ, I have been quite heavily involved in those deliberations and consultation on the tax side. However, the challenge is to get a wider stakeholder grouping involved in that process. And as Danny said, the labour movement wasn't consulted to the degree that he would have liked. And in other jurisdictions, this is addressed by having a different approach to the budget process. And certainly when it comes to dealing with fundamental changes in the tax regime, that they're not announced overnight, as it were. There's a process where there's for example, a green paper is developed and issued. It will be issued to the public, and the public is invited to submit their suggestions. So not only are we talking about a broader number of stakeholders and interest groups, the wider general public have access to that process. And so therefore it's more transparent, and I think that's something that we need to address going forward, is this budget process, how we go about our budgets. There's also an issue in terms of the fact that we have these budgets annually, but we don't seem to tie them into our more medium-term frameworks and our longer-term planning framework. But in terms of the consultation process, which is what the question is focused on, I think there are processes which exist out there that we've used internationally that we need to look at them again or utilize them. They have occurred in other areas, but on tax side, we need to utilize them extensively.
And I would say there was a level of consultation in this budget round, particularly through a particular working of the Partnership for Transformation, which is the tax policy and administration working. I personally believe that the consultation needs to be much broader than that. And in particular ought to not only focus on the revenue side, which tends to be most controversial, but also focus upon the priorities that are driving the expenditure side of the budget. And I think that the government would be well advised to promote that level of consultation on that side of the budget also.
All right, thank you very much. Now, one of the major impediments to growth in Jamaica has been the very high level of interest rates. And with the JDX, with fiscal responsibility, we have seen interest rates come down to record lows. We are now seeing tax reforms that address capital markets directly. And I give that prelude within the context of the question that Mr. Gregory Dale is asking. What's the best way or method of investment for economic climate? Schnoor, you spoke about what the reforms will do to the capital markets. Can you develop a little bit on that point to answer Mr. Dale's question?
Adrian, I think, as you said, we haven't seen interest rates at this level of 30 years. I think we're kind of going up at least for the last 2 or 3 decades. Just going in a financial institution, take out the CD or refund, and earn a significant tangible rate of return. You're happy. Now you're going to have to look into different investment. This is where the stock market comes in. This is where looking at a they are going to have to look at new instruments that they're going to have to create in the marketplace, whether they be derivatives, whether they be the corporate loan market, commercial paper market, looking at different types of investments that we can offer to our structured products to really encourage investment in the country. And we're going to have to really play a different role than we have played in the past. I think it's a changing environment, it's new, it's different. A lot of banks, dealers have not had to deal with some new situations before, at least in some of our working lives. But it certainly is a challenge that we need to meet if we want to come through. We just cannot continue what we have done for the last 2 decades, which is just simply lending. These have to be behind us and get our fiscal house in order, therefore we need to go out there.
Thank you. Samantha, quick follow-up?
Yeah, quick follow-up on that. One of the things I'd like to say is that I sit on a number of boards, and I sit on a number also of boards of trustees of pensions, which are major sources of investment. And what has really encouraged me in recent times about the conversations that are taking place at those board tables is a recognition, just as Anya has indicated, that if we want to achieve the kind of returns that we have been accustomed to, then we need to look away from paper investments and more towards productive investments. So the pension funds are looking at greater allocations to the equity markets, greater allocations to the real estate markets. I think it's also a fact that in the same way as individual investors have had a bias because of high interest rates over time towards commercial paper, what has happened in the financial sector is also that some of the skills for investment and supporting and facilitating and intermediating investment in the public sector have atrophied. And the time has come for us now to refresh those skills. And I'm sure that Anna, within Scotia, significant efforts are being made in that regard. But that is what we require. We need to turn towards productive investments that are going to solve the kind of problems that Brian is talking about with our balance of payments. We need to earn our way in the world. And the sooner we start doing that,
All right, thank you very much. Mary Ship is asking quite, I would say, provocative question. And I put it to Mr. Don Roberts. Is it possible to remove PAYE? That's the question.
I don't think there's no country in the world.
one or two, very small, came out.
But I don't think certainly that can be on our agenda in the short. Not right now. We have to do a lot of work in terms of tax structure. Certainly not yet.
What we could perhaps look forward to is a day when PAYE threshold, that is the income above which you begin paying tax, is on the order of 10 or 15,000 US dollars a year, or $1.5 million Jamaican dollars a year. I think that is certainly an objective that can we set ourselves, and it certainly would be more in keeping with the threshold of income at which tax begins to be paid in most other jurisdictions around Europe.
Yes, and just another comment as well. I mean, in terms of the issue of PAYE as a mechanism to collect tax, given that we're talking about the need to bring more people into the system and pay their taxes, that everybody pays a fair share of taxes. If we abolished PAYE, that would mean, of course, if we still have income tax, that means that those people will simply be employees will still have to pay their taxes. So that would now require a huge resource requirement on the part of the tax administration to go after every individual, where obviously when they go after employers in lesser numbers,